Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the vote choice. Basically, why do people select the presidential candidate that they select? When they go to the polls to select a senator, why do they choose a Republican or a Democrat? When they vote for local elections, why do they choose one candidate over the other? That's the essence of vote choice. So let's back up. Last time we talked about turnout, and there is actually a very big difference between turnout and the choice. We talked about how every voter must choose first whether to show up at the polls, and second, which candidate they're going to support. We're going to talk about this second choice now, but it's important to remember these are different mental processes and they require completely different theories. The things that affect turnout are not the same as those that affect which candidate a person chooses. So what does determine which candidates a person chooses? That's actually a very simple process, and there are four factors that can largely explain why people choose one candidate or the other. We're just going to list each one, then we're going to talk about a couple of them in detail, and then we're going to see just how predictive these factors are. So first of all is party identification. We've already hinted at it, but let's reiterate. What is party identification? You can think of it like a religion or support for a sports team. What the political science literature has found is that party identification is mostly about an emotional attachment to the party. You like a party and you dislike the other party. In psychology, technically, this is called affect, but we're just going to refer to it as likes or dislikes or an emotional attachment. Party identification is the single best predictor of how an individual votes. If somebody likes a Republican Party, 90 to 95% of the time, that person is going to vote for that party. So this is something that is the single best predictor of how people vote. So any understanding of the vote choice begins with party identification. Again, it is the single best predictor. It is a major factor in determining how people vote. The second one is the economy. When the economy is good, the public tends to reward the party in power. So for example, in 1984, Ronald Reagan, a Republican, was the President of the United States and the economy was booming. And the public rewarded him for the great economy. In fact, that was one of the biggest landslide victories in the history of our country. And alternatively, when the economy is bad, for instance in 2008, the economy was in the tank and the public punished the Republicans who had the presidency and elected a Democrat, President Obama. The political science jargon term that we use for this is retrospective voting. You don't even remember that term, just remember that people tend to reward the party in power when the economy is good, and they tend to punish that party when the economy is bad. The third factor is incumbency. Basically, is the president up for re-election, or is a U.S. senator running for re-election? Incumbents tend to have an advantage over non-incumbents. So at the presidential level, as we'll talk about later, incumbents tend to have about 1.5% better vote share on election day than non-incumbents do. What that means is that people just simply tend to recognize and to know more about somebody who is already in office, and that gives them an inherent advantage. And then finally, demographics are somewhat of a strong influence. Demographics just refers to social characteristics such as race, income, gender, religion, region. We tend to talk about the parties as coalitions of different groups, and these demographic groups make up those coalitions. So let's talk about demographics briefly. You don't need to know the specifics of this. You do need to know demographics do have an influence on how people vote. But we're going to look at both parties' coalitions. This is a simplification, by the way. This is not the full list of all the different groups that are aligned with each party. But Democrats, they tend to do much better among African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, and other racial minorities. They tend to do better among low income and somewhat better among middle income, though it's much more of an even split there. They tend to do better among Jewish, Catholic, and non-religious citizens, and they tend to do better among residents in the Northeast and the West Coast. Republicans, on the other hand, tend to do much better among whites, among upper income individuals, and also some upper middle income. Do very well among Protestant Christians, especially those that we refer to as evangelicals, or sometimes referred to as born-again Christians, and other groups that are highly religious. And finally, Republicans tend to do very well in the South and also fairly well in the Midwest. So that just gives you a sense of how the different demographics in our country divide along partisan lines. How well do these factors predict election outcomes? As it turns out, they are really, really good predictors. To give you an idea about this, I ran a statistical model in 2012 to try to forecast the presidential election. And the model simply was the share of the vote we would expect President Obama and Governor Mitt Romney to receive that year. And there were three simple variables. Job approval, which is to say the percentage of the public that thought that President Obama was doing a good job. GDP growth in the third quarter, in the second quarter, GDP is just a measure of the economy. When GDP has high growth, we say that the economy is good. When GDP is negative, we call that a recession. So it's just a measure of how well the economy is doing. And of course, President Obama was running for re-election, so there was an incumbent in the election, and I wanted to model that. Keep in mind that my model used data from August 2012. That was a couple of months before the election occurred. So this is a forecast in the same way that people trying to forecast the weather try to predict what the weather is going to be 2 or 3 days. Here, the model is used to predict the outcome of the election several months before the election happens. And keep in mind, this is before either one of the campaigns had geared up. The campaigns, they had not had any presidential debates. They had not had any rallies. They did not, the course of the campaign had not played out. This was before most of that started. Now, if you're a data nerd or a math nerd, here's my models. You'll notice I've got a third-party variable in there. It's not really based on theory. It's just a statistical trick. When a major third-party candidate runs in the election, like Ross Perot in 1992, then we want to control for that because that lowers the vote share for the two major parties. So, that's not really important to keep in mind. So how well did this model do in leading up to the presidential election? Well, again, we simply wanted to, in August, predict what share of the vote we would expect President Obama to get and what share of the vote we would expect Governor Romney to get. So we'll have the predicted vote, we'll have the actual vote, we'll compare those two. The model predicted that President Obama would receive 51.1% of the vote, and the model predicted that Governor Romney would receive about 48.3% of the vote. What were the actual results? Well, the model actually nailed President Obama's share of the vote, and it was only off by about 1% for Governor Romney's vote. So again, think about this. It means that the four factors that we talked about, particularly presidential approval, which measures party identification, by the way, if that wasn't obvious, Democrats have a higher approval rating of the president than do Republicans. So presidential approval actually does measure party identification. And the state of the economy, those two factors were very, very accurate in predicting the outcome, and that was without even mentioning things like the campaign or candidate characteristics or all of that. So it gives you a sense of just how powerful these things are in explaining, and I'll go ahead and apologize, it also frankly makes presidential elections very boring. Most of the time for the election, we know months in advance who's going to win. We knew in 2008, for instance, that President Obama was going to win the election. The reason was the economy was very bad. President Bush's approval rating was down about 20%, which is very, very low. And based on those two things alone, any Democrat would have won that election. And same for 2012. The economy wasn't great, but it was recovering by then, and so people rewarded President Obama for that. So let's wrap up. The main point is that these four factors are the best predictors. Vote choice is very simple to understand. That's why this is a very short lecture. But it does raise a question, do candidates and campaigns matter? And the answer is yes, but they tend to have a very small effect. In particular, the effect tends to only be about 2 to 4%. So if one candidate is much more likable than the other candidate, then they will get rewarded for that. But again, it's a very small effect. This can be very important for a close election, especially things like gaffes or blunders. It can turn an election that is very, very close, but for most elections, it actually doesn't determine the winner. So most elections, we know in August, based on the economy, presidential approval, and incumbency, who's going to win. So finally, let's talk about the 2016 election that's coming up. Obviously, if we're using factors that we only know in August, we're going to have to wait till August to make the official forecast, but I'll go ahead and give you a preliminary forecast. Keep in mind, this is not the official quote-unquote forecast. This is just something that I wanted to run the model for the 2016 early just to give you a sense of where it might be headed. The model assumes that the state of the economy and President Obama's approval rating in August will be the same as it is today. Now, we're getting close to August. Somewhere around the middle of August, I'll be able to do this, but unfortunately, the class will be over by then. So if you're interested in a revised model, just send me an email. I'll tell you what I found. So GDP growth today is the last quarter was about 1.5%. Obama's approval rating is about 50%. There's no incumbent running. And as far as we know right now, there's no serious third-party challenger. So I just coded the model as there not being a third party. So what does the model predict for 2016 November election? Well, here's the prediction. Shows a very close race, and it shows Mr. Trump with a small lead over Secretary Hillary Clinton. Now, let me say a few caveats here. This does not mean that Donald Trump will absolutely win the election. This does not mean that Hillary Clinton will lose the election. In fact, the model shows that the election is way too close for us to be able to call, for us to be able to say which one's most likely to win. So this is actually one of the few elections where, based on this preliminary model, we really don't know who's going to win, and those daily events, the blunders, the gaffes, the debates, those actually could influence the outcome of the election. Let me also say that this, not only does this not mean that Donald Trump will win the election, it also doesn't mean that he's going to win by exactly 0.7% of the vote, right? It's very possible for him to win by, 1, 2, or even 3% based on this model. It's very possible for Clinton to win by 2 or 3% based on the model. What all this means is that this election, this early, we simply don't know who's going to win. So that's my prediction. And this is me just kind of speaking off the cuff and just talking about the model and media commentary. I've been actually very skeptical of a lot of the media commentary that dismisses Donald Trump's chances of winning. There's been a sense among a lot of pundits and political commentators that Donald Trump has no chance of winning. He actually does. And this is, I believe, true regardless of whether you support him or you oppose him, whatever your thoughts about Trump or Clinton. The reality is that I think that the media commentary has been a little too dismissive about his chances. My own model shows him with a very small advantage in terms of winning. And what I think this shows is that based on the economy, based on presidential approval, that he actually has a better chance of winning than most people believe. Finally, here's some advice heading into the 2016 election. First of all, watch the state of the economy and presidential approval. We'll have the updated GDP numbers in a few weeks, and that'll let us, make a forecast. If the job growth is very bad, if the economy goes south, if there's some negative change in the economy, that's going to make it very hard for Hillary Clinton to win. If all the economic news coming out in the next couple of weeks is very good, it's going to make it very hard for Donald Trump to win. And then also watch presidential approval. Ignore most of the media events and the campaign events. This may be the hardest thing to do because it's very easy to jump on that one gaffe or that one blunder and say, oh, that's going to hurt this candidate's chances or that's going to decide the election. All right? Maybe it does, but most of the time these gaffes and blunders matter very, very little. And the daily campaign stuff, the rallies, the television interviews, all of that stuff, that also matters very, very little. Watch the debates. Those do have an effect. However, the bump that a candidate gets from performing very well in a debate, or the decline in the polls that they get if they do very poorly in debate, that typically only lasts about a week. A candidate might increase their standing in the poll by 2 to 3%, sometimes as high as 4%, and then a week later, the race is right back to where it was always going to be. Finally, polls will change throughout the race. It's very easy to latch on to a poll today that shows Hillary Clinton in the lead. That's going to change. The race is going to narrow, and at some point she's going to have an even bigger lead. So watch the polls, but also understand that there's a snapshot at any given time. Having said that, the weekend before the election, and particularly the day before the election, the polls are going to be very close to the actual result. So if we head into the weekend before Election Day, and especially Monday before the Election Day, and the polls show, for example, Clinton with a 3 to 4% lead in the polls, you can be pretty sure that she's going to win. If Donald Trump has a 3 to 4% lead in the polls, you can be pretty sure he's going to win. If the polls are very close, within 1%, you might as well flip a coin if you're wanting to know who wins. And it's probably going to be a very long night on Tuesday before we eventually know who the winner is and who the next president of the United States is. So again, short lecture here just because the topic is honestly one of the simplest to understand, and I'm sorry if that makes presidential elections kind of boring for you. I think that there is a very interesting irony that these are the campaigns that get the most media coverage, the most excitement, and yet most of them are predetermined. Most of them based on the economy, presidential approval, and incumbency. We know months in advance. This 2016 may be one of the few elections that we don't know that, but most of the time they are not very exciting affairs. So I hope that gives you some help in how to navigate the immense media coverage that's going to occur during the election through August, September, and October. And we will see you next time.